Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be writing some JavaScript. And that's one of the nice things about JavaScript is that you actually want to see and make it interact and update some of your content and visual content within your HTML page. Again, main purposes of JavaScript is that interaction and creating that dynamic content. So let's get rid of the button here. And we are going to be revisiting that a little bit later on. And we're also going to get rid of linking out to the script file. In order to keep things fairly simple and straightforward, we're going to be writing all of our JavaScript within this index.html and then just simply saving them as the proper lesson names. And typically when you are developing your web projects, you would be linking out to a script.js file, and there are a lot of benefits to that, just as you don't want to have your JavaScript within your elements as attributes because they are difficult to find if you've got a lot of code. So it's easier to separate it out just as you do with CSS. The same thing with the JS files. If you've got a really big website and you want to use the JavaScript across multiple HTML pages and have it do the same type of functionality, then you can simply link out to your script file, save you a lot of time and effort. So it's a great way to go, and it's a great option with JavaScript. So now let's write some script. And as promised, I do want to make and write out some JavaScript code. So first of all, a little bit of housekeeping before we get started into the code. So there are a number of ways that we can write JavaScript. And as we saw in the earlier lesson, if I refresh this page, I can write in my JavaScript within my console. So there is a thing called the document, and this is the document object. And what it is essentially when your browser renders out all of your HTML page, it renders it out into the document object, or otherwise known as the DOM. And as you can see here, the document actually contains all of the information that's available within my web page. And there is actually a better way to actually see this more visually and output it. So there's a number of ways to communicate with your console. So there's console log, and the one I'm going to use is console directory. I'm going to take that same document object and place that into console directory, and see it outputs that document again, but this time it's got it within the document object model. So this is a set of all the different pieces and elements that are available within your page, and it gives you a quick overview of how the browser is actually building out your web page. So you can see you've got your document elements, and really there's just a ton of stuff here, child nodes, and you can see head, text, body, and all of this. And what this basically means is, and I don't really expect you to memorize all of this stuff, just know that it's there, and this is what we're connecting with when we're writing our JavaScript. And in order to connect with it, so just as we did console directory here, we know that whatever code we write here on the right-hand side, we can also write in the left-hand side. So let me make this a little bit bigger, and I'm going to simply copy and paste it in. And another thing to note that I've got semicolons at the end of each one of these statements. So every time you do a statement in JavaScript, you should include the semicolon. It's not going to break if you don't, but it is good practice to keep that in line there. So let's refresh the page, and just as we saw those alerts popping up, we see that now we've got that document object being rendered out. So I don't have to type this console directory in here anymore within my console. I can actually automatically get it output. Also, another side note, so console directory and console log is our way to communicate with what's happening within the console. So this is meant for developers, and it's not meant for the general viewer of your website to be consuming that. And as you can see, they don't see that this is happening behind the scenes. And this is all information that's available anyway. We're just writing it out, and we're console logging it out in our console. So this is a console. Well, that's why it's called console. And we console log and console directory, we can take a closer look at it. And that's the whole purpose when we're debugging our applications, while we do console logs and console directories. And again, more on that in the upcoming lessons. So we've got our URL where the file is located. which is really cool because this is a huge JavaScript object. And it gives us the ability, once again, to connect to this. And I'm going to be covering objects in more detail. So if you want to have some fun, or if you've got a few hours to kill, you can always go to console directory and look through all of the document, how it's being represented. So next, what I wanted to do is I want to connect to this JavaScript, this word JavaScript. And for now, let's do a quick update. And we're just going to change this to an H1 tag. So H1 closing, H1 opening tag, refresh it, and there is my H tag. So this is just regular HTML, H tag, header tag. And as you can see, console directory still outputs, console log still outputs. And that's the difference between writing it within the console here, because every time you refresh the page, this information is gone. And when you write it in your file within your source code, every time you load the page, the browser renders out that information. So that's the big difference there, in case you were wondering. So next, let's connect to this particular element and update the content of it. And we can do this really easy with JavaScript. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to select that document object. So that's that same one that we see over here on the right-hand side with all of these values and all of this information. And of course, we are going to be doing more on this in the upcoming lessons. So next, what we want to do is a built-in method within JavaScript, and that's query selector. And you are going to start getting really familiar with these, especially query selector. It's used all the time. And we're going to grab our H1 tag. So we have, just like we're using CSS, we can select elements within our page. Thus we're able to grab that H1 tag. And now we're going to have some fun with this. So we've got another function. So these are a set of built-in functions in JavaScript called inner HTML. And that inner HTML can equal whatever we want it to equal. What's going to happen here, and let me get this all on one line. So unfortunately, I think I've made the text a little bit too big. So let's make it a little bit smaller. And I'm also going to move them in over to the left-hand side. And typically you want to align it within the script tags. But just because I've got limited real estate here, I've just pulled them all over to the left-hand side. So we've got our document query selector, so that's the function. So just think of it just as the alert, think of it as the log, as the directory. These are all built-in methods, functions within JavaScript, and we are going to be covering them in more detail. Please bear with me while I just show you how we can update that inner HTML. And then everything else, what we've done here, we're going to be dissecting in the upcoming lessons and really getting familiar with what's happening here. So we're making our selection, and again, this one is purple color as well. So that's a built-in value within JavaScript, so the inner HTML. And then it's expecting a parameter, so we're equaling it to hello world. So what do you think is going to happen here? Just quickly looking at this. So we know we've got this document object, huge, full of all kinds of information. We're using a method that's contained within there where we're finding, just like we do with CSS, finding our HTML elements, and we don't really have a whole lot here. So we've got an H1 and we've got a button, and we're grabbing that, selecting that, and we're placing that inner HTML of it, and we're equaling it to hello world. So another way to kind of look at this, and let me clear this one up, is I can do document.querySelector H1, and we see that when I click that, it's returning that element information. And that's important to note. So again, what do you think is going to happen when I refresh the page? And notice this inner HTML. What do you think is going to happen here? And if you said that the JavaScript is going to magically transform into hello world, you are correct, because that's exactly what happened here. Whenever we connected with that element, this element no longer says hello world. And if I try to access it again with the query selector, now the value has changed. And that's where JavaScript is dynamic. So this is an important core principle of JavaScript, is that it's dynamic. It's a living web page. We can change things, we can grab things, we can interact with things on the web page. And it's all contained within this document object. And this is where the true connection with JavaScript and HTML is. if you aren't familiar with JavaScript, and if you think we're going a little bit too fast, I am going to be covering this in more detail, but this is an important core principle of JavaScript. And I know a lot of people are excited to get started with JavaScript, and they want to make things happen and change within your web pages. So that's why I've started out with this within earlier lessons. And coming up, we're going to be doing some dissection of this and find out what the meaning of all of these methods really truly is. So now it's up to you. I want you to try this out for yourself. So go ahead and take a look at the document object. You can console directory, or you can open up the browser that you're watching the video in right now, open up the console and do console.directory and then bracket around document. Type that in, paste that in, and that will give you the document object of the current page you're on, which will be different than the document object that I'm on because the values are different. And this is what the browser is using in order to, this is what the browser is rendering out, its rendition of the web page content. So it's, if your HTML is different, your document object is going to be different. And then we've got our console log.hello. So that's just a quick message. So just as you were doing the alerts, send yourself a console log message, say hello to yourself or some other interesting message, send yourself an interesting message essentially. So that's the second part of the challenge. And then last but not least is the document. Use query selector and select an element on your page. So even if this was H, and you can play around with this a little bit. So you can select that H2 and you can see that H2, now it's selected that. If you had kept this as H1, nothing would happen. And we actually wouldn't be able to make that selection and we'd throw a JavaScript error. So more on that later on. So make sure that whatever element you're trying to select actually exists. That's the important part of JavaScript. And then you can use the inner HTML and equal it to, again, whatever message you want. So I know there's quite a few challenges here. So do try these out. In the next lesson, we're going to dive deeper into the meaning of all of this.